Let Scott. Scott, do you want to weigh in on this?
I understand what you're saying about the military-industrial complex and certainly agree with that. I would add to that that there's a banking complex in addition to that, and that uses leveraging and debt to essentially deindustrialize the country, as Michael Hudson has put it, creating a situation where basically we're destroying companies and outsourcing. That's on one aspect, and the other aspect is using the assets of the companies against them as a form of debt, which enriches certain people, like, say, Mitt Romney, but at the expense of the working and middle classes. So is this a miscalculation by American government, or is this just something that happened because the rentier class, let's call them, became so big and powerful they became out of control?
To run riot. And here comes my answer. And you know, I mean, it's not that I am making it up. In 1970-71, a young man back then in Washington, D.C., by the name of Paul Volcker, was working for another gentleman called Dr. Henry Kissinger before Henry Kissinger moved to the State Department, when he was still at the National Security Advisor. And in that document, in that report by Volcker to Kissinger, we read effectively what was going to happen in the next 20 years. Volcker asked a very simple question. He said, now that the United States is shifting from a surplus to a deficit position, how can it maintain its hegemony? And the answer he gave himself, which is typical Paul Volcker, was, well, if we can't recycle our own surpluses, we have to recycle other people's surpluses. And what happened, and we all know that after the 1970s, is we have a complete reversal of the global plan era, of the Bretton Woods era. In the Bretton Woods era, remember, the United States was a surplus country. It was selling more to Europe and to Japan than it was importing. And its surpluses were then recycled through administrative channels to Germany, to France, to Japan, so that the demand would be created for more exports from the United States to Europe and Asia. After 1973, you have a complete reversal of this thing. What you have is the United States is operating like a huge vacuum cleaner, sucking into its territory the net exports of Japan, of Germany, and of course later China. And how was it financing this expanding deficit? It was financing it through a major flow of capital, of surpluses, from Germany, Japan, and later China to Wall Street. And then Wall Street was using this money either in order to channel it in the form of foreign direct investment, or to purchase US Treasury bills and finance the deficit of the federal government, or effectively to play the game, the new game of financialization. Because what do bankers do when you give them between $3 and $5 billion net daily to play with? They find ways of making it grow through the creation of financial instruments. Now, my answer therefore to the question, why did the regulators allow the banks to create the banking complex that you referred to, Scott, is very simple. Because the flow into Wall Street of these tsunamis of capital, of profits from Europe and from Japan, and later from Russia and China, of course, these flows were essential for maintaining this new model of American hegemony. And unfortunately, victims of that new model of global surplus recycling were the American blue-collar workers, the American middle class, because keeping a lid on American wage inflation, effectively turning it into wage deflation, was one of the mechanisms by which foreign capital was attracted into Wall Street, and why foreign capital found higher returns in the United States than anywhere else.
Following up on that, we now have a situation where the foreign capital is coming in, and you're not getting the productivity out of this country anymore. So obviously the jobs are disappearing. First the wages were deflated, now the jobs are going away entirely. And another thing, in respect to that with China, now China has $1.5 trillion or perhaps $2.5 trillion in our treasuries. And some people have suggested that we start taxing or otherwise discouraging China from buying treasuries because in effect they're strengthening the dollar and weakening the yuan or the renminbi, and that's making their goods cheaper and ours more expensive, even though it's not because we're producing better goods, it's simply a currency manipulation. So would you be in favor of making it more difficult for China to buy our treasuries and to manipulate downward their currency with respect to ours?
No, I certainly wouldn't. I consider this to be a thoroughly unconvincing take on what's going on. Look, China became effectively an expanded Hong Kong, a new version of Japan. It wasn't that China took over Hong Kong, Hong Kong took over China, right? Their developmental model was completely adapted to the global hegemonic model that the United States put into place after 1970s, with Paul Volcker actually as one of the major agents of that change since he took over the Fed in the late 1970s. Now, China understands that which Germany doesn't these days, or Europe doesn't, that you can have two of the following three things. You can have free trade, of the three things being free trade, free capital movements, and control exchange rates. You can't have all three. Now, I think it's absolutely understandable from the perspective of China that in the global environment that America built and in which China was trying to extricate itself from poverty in the 1980s and 1990s, that the two things that they selected was free trade and a control exchange rate. They did not choose capital freedom. And that was quite right. Now, when the United States of America, as Paul Volcker advocated back in 1970, 71, decided to build the strength of its own elites, not of its own middle class, but of its own elites, of the Mitt Romneys of the world. Not average Jack working in declining manufacturing in middle America, but Mitt Romney. The moment that they decided to impose that model upon the world, China had no alternative than to do what it did. And at the moment, given the design of the global system, an effective design, a kind of spontaneous order that emerged from the choices in the 1970s and 80s and 90s of the United States administration, it would be senseless, utterly senseless, to make it harder for China to purchase US treasuries. This would simply make the American budget deficit harder to refinance. It would make the American debt more expensive. It would create a serious debt problem in the United States, when I don't think that the United States has a serious debt problem. It has other problems, but the debt is just a symptom, it's not a main cause. When you have a country like China, which is trying to build up its economy, and remember, if China implodes today, the United States is going to suffer really badly. China is going to implode if it can't maintain a growth rate of around 6-7% minimum, because they are a country on the move. They are a country where there is huge internal migration that has to be maintained in order to maintain stability, political and social stability in China, and not to have another repetition of Yeltsin's Russia. Because if we have this repetition of Yeltsin's Russia, I can assure you that Europe is going to go under, and then there's going to be a domino effect that's going to affect adversely the United States. Now, I'm not saying that the current state of affairs is either defensible or it can be maintained. It causes increasing inequality, both across the world and within the United States. It's destabilizing the social fabric. It is causing American manufacturing to shrivel and die. And all these things are things that we have seriously to look into. But effectively, to turn this into a zero-sum game between America and China, and to say that, as Mitt Romney was promising, that he's going to make life hard for China and to treat it as a currency manipulator, this is ridiculous. We live in a world where all the major powers are currency manipulators. The United States is a currency manipulator through QE. China is a currency manipulator. Germany is a currency manipulator by imposing austerity on the rest of the Eurozone and therefore keeping the euro relatively low compared to what its own currency would have been, given that it has 3 times the current account surplus that China does. This is a game. The global monetary environment is a game. Everybody is gaming. The question that we should be asking ourselves is not how are we going to take a bazooka each and start killing each other, because then we'll all end up dead. But the question is, how can we actually infuse a little bit of rationality to this global system? And I think that the first period after the First World War, the Bretton Woods era, offers us good clues as to I'm not supposing or suggesting that we should reproduce that the Bretton Woods era. We can't do that. It's bygones. But nevertheless, there are some important clues in there about what we need to do now in order to stabilize our economies, both here in the United States, in Europe, in China, in Latin America. They are completely out of kilter at the moment. And this is not going to be done through punitive impositions of tariffs. It's not going to be done through taxing the treasury holdings of China. It has to happen on the basis of a new Bretton Woods agreement, a new Bretton Woods conference, and I would recommend for that the G20 as a starting place. And in particular, you know what I would recommend? I would recommend that the G20 should initiate the creation of a new international organization, which I would call the WDO, the World Development Organization, that should be the effective bulwark that stabilizes the damage caused by the World Trade Organization.